Hello, hello, you guys. So, you guys know that I read everybody's comments, okay? I'm sure I'm not perfect. There's probably some comments that I missed, but for the most part, if you leave a comment on my page, I will not only read your comment, I will often respond to your comment if I have something to say. I'm not going to just be talking to be talking, but if I have something to say, I will respond to your comment. Hi, I'm glad you caught 2 days, 2 days, two lives in 2 days too. Um, but I do pay attention to dissenting comments. So I always appreciate comments where we agree, but I also really appreciate comments where we disagree. And so there were a couple of comments that were along the same line that made me feel like, I think we really need to have a conversation. And one of those comments asked me, why would I teach that history? Specifically speaking of Dred Scott, why would I teach that history? Why would I bring up something if, the amendments have been passed to make us citizens? Another comment was, kind of insinuating that I vilify. And this comment was made by somebody who's been subscribed to my channel, I'm sure for years. I don't know how many years, but at least three, possibly four. And so he was saying, well, why would you, I'm not going to vilify Dred Scott and this and that. And he thought I was misinterpreting Dred's thought process and stuff like that. So I thought this is really interesting, and I want to have a conversation with you guys, okay? And this conversation is surrounded about why I delve into historical documents and I tie the mindsets of people into modern day. All right. I want to be clear. We can love our ancestors, right? We don't have to be ashamed of our ancestry, and we can love our ancestors while keeping it real. We got to be able to do both. We have to be able to love our ancestors. I'm speaking to Black people whose ancestors were slaves, okay, in this country or any other. We need to be able to love them and then also keep it real about their mindset. In the same way that I can say, I wouldn't look at a person's white skin and say they were bad, but I don't really trust a white person who is in denial about their culture, who's in denial about the mindsets that allowed the barbarianism that their people engaged in every corner of the earth. I wouldn't trust a white person who didn't feel comfortable being honest about that. I just wouldn't. I'd be looking at you like, you know what? Now, you know, and I know that your people are barbaric. You know, and I know that your people have and continue to bust all the wrong moves. In that same way that we're willing to bring white people to task and we would be incensed and we would never understand if a white person tried to deny things that are clearly obvious. In that same way, right? But I would never tell a white person, oh, be ashamed to be white. Or why are you vilifying your ancestors? No, if your ancestors were in the wrong, if your culture is in the wrong, if Greece and Rome were filled with homosexuals and that caused them to fall, if your hatred of women and murder, like literally murdering your children and sacrificing them to gods, if that is not horrible and you're not willing to recognize it, well then you run the risk of behaving just like them. And if I say that about white people, Black people understand that, right? We're not sitting around here trying to cape for any weird stuff that white people engage in. We're not about to do it, okay? In that same way, I call us to look at our ancestors' behavior too. Somebody said to me on my Dred Scott video, look, we can't get into the mentality of a slave. A lot of those people were born into slavery. They knew nothing but slavery. So why a slave would go into a free state with his wife and children, right? And not leave when the law is on his side, all you have to do is leave. Because technically you're free once you enter the state. But so many masters took their slaves into free states, and it was normal for the slaves to not leave. He said, you can't compare it. And my response to him was, look, family, then how do you explain the slaves that were first generation slaves? Because it was deep into slavery, you guys. It was generations of slaves that were brought fresh from Africa. They did not cut off the transatlantic slave trade in the first 50 or 100 years. Okay? At some point, at some point in America, white people were literally breeding slaves throughout all of the Midwest and the South. Okay? You had a lot of breeding farms where literally they would just have slaves having sex with each other for the purpose of breeding them. But that was later in the conversation of slavery. You constantly had fresh African blood being infused into the slave population. Constantly. Can we make excuses for the mindset of people who had never seen anything like chattel slavery? How do you explain that away? My argument is that those individuals were weak-minded and passive, and that they passed on their weakness and their passivity to their children, and that we share that same weak mindset today as Black people. And you guys don't have to like me for saying it, but it just is what it is. And if you want to debate me, and if you want to disagree with me about the weakness and passivity of Black people, then you explain for me why in every encounter Blacks have had with Europeans, except for places like Ethiopia, which blood integrated if they weren't dominated and are fiscally dominated today, why every encounter ended up in our domination? Why is Africa in the hands and control, either fiscally or physically, by white people? Why did the oceanic countries, the oceanic islands, end up with masses of Black people being massacred and dominated? This didn't just happen in America. It's not because I want to vilify Dred Scott. I don't read slave narrative. You guys know I read a lot of historical documents on this channel. I don't read white people's opinions of us and Black people's opinions of ourselves from a historical standpoint because I have disdain for our ancestors. I do it because just like we call white people to task for their ancestors' thought processes and behaviors, just like we can see that you don't go generation after generation broken and crazy and diabolical and barbaric and then just pop out in 2021 a perfect human being completely detached from how your ancestors behaved for hundreds of years into the modern century. Just like I will do that, why would I not do that with Black people? We'll never progress if we can't have an honest conversation about the mentality of our ancestors, especially when we carry those same mentalities today. We think the same way today. That is why I go into this. I go into those historical texts because a lot of you think the same way today. That is how our minds are grounded today. And why? Because generationally, we have passed down that broken, passive, pathetic, bottom feeding mentality. Generation after generation, because it's too disrespectful for us to be honest about the fact that broken, subdued, dominated people teach their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, their great-great-great-grandchildren, all the way to the blood that flows through our body, their broken, passive nature, their bottom feeding nature. We have no aspiration for dominance. We have no aspiration for control. We only want acceptance and integration because this is all that we have ever been taught. We've never been taught anything different. In fact, when a person tells you, we see how the rulership for hundreds of years has gone. We have seen entire populations of people in every single country that the European has tread on the planet. There are almost no native people left. They're all dead. They are bred out, they are dead, they were massacred, and in their place is a system that we are then mentally integrated into accepting as our own, to the point that we celebrate holidays that have nothing to do with us, because we are so attached to the European mindset that we cannot conceive it. And this is not about dating, because there's always somebody that brings up dating, and it's not about that. The European managed to have sex with every single person that they encountered, but they maintained their dominance. It's not about sex. It's not about who you have sex with. If it was about that, then they wouldn't be in control, because they were having sex with everybody. They were out here making babies with the Guatemalans. They were out here making babies with the Brazilians. They were out here making babies in South Africa. In the Congo, they were chopping off the men's arms and legs with one hand and making babies with the other hand. When they completely wiped out the Tasmanians, they were having sex with Tasmanian women and then killing every Black Tasmanian in the same breath. And now there are none of them left. This is beyond sex. This is about your mentality. Because even in having sex, our mentality is so degraded, we can't even weaponize sex. The European was like, I will have sex with you and annihilate you in the same breath. It's all the same to me. We have sex and we become self annihilatory. The European could take a wife of any group of people they were dominating and never shake a spot about their own domination. Never so much as never so much as flinched about their own domination. They would tell their mixed children that whiteness was better and then encourage. You had actual countries where the legal policy of the land, the law of the land, was that mixed children were to breed white. They would create a mixed child and then teach them white superiority. So this is not about sex. It's about the mentality, the degraded mentality of our people. If I can't speak about historical, look, you hear it from their own mouths. This is why I go into historical commentary. Because if I come up here and I tell you that our ancestors' minds were twisted, y'all are going to argue with me. My purpose in bringing up the historical commentary of our people and the observations that white people have made about the passivity, the self-hatred of our people, if I bring a thing that comes and says the height of the Black man wanting a white woman is not to annihilate the white race, but it is because it is the pinnacle of their aspiration. And then I have YouTube full of Black men that are talking about how white women are better. My point in bringing the historical narrative forth is not to bash Black men, but to say, think about this. Your mentality has been clocked for hundreds of years. If I speak about the weaponization of Black women and the harm caused to Black women being used as a way to prove to Black men that they are no competition for white men, the narrative is not brought forth to shame a Black woman or a Black man. I bring the narrative forth because, do you think this has disappeared? Do you think because it is more covert, it does not exist? Do you think that us pretending that our ancestors were simply victims, which is how white people treat it? White people treat our history as Black people as though our ancestors were simply victims. And thank you, Samson Killer. I appreciate that Cash App. But white people treat our ancestors as if they were simply victims. Every slave movie you watch is the poor, downtrodden, innocent, good-hearted Black person being drugged through the mud by the dominant, strong, powerful white man. I want to teach different history. I want to teach about people who had the power and often tried to overcome, but were overwhelmed by the masses of Black people who were stagnant in their mindset, weak minded, passive to a flaw. People who were so weak that even when freedom was at their doorstep, their minds were so enslaved they could not conceive to leave. One of you guys commented that the Dred Scott case was funded by abolitionists. Do you realize that abolitionists were nothing but wealthy white people in a struggle for power with other wealthy white people from the South? We look at the abolitionist movement the way it was taught to us in Eurocentric schools. The abolitionist movement was not about a bunch of white people who just had really great hearts and humanity and saw the atrocities of slavery. Anytime you see a movement with that much money behind it, you know it's not about Black people. I think Black Lives Matter is an excellent example of using dead Black bodies, using the loss of Black life to push an agenda that is not Black focused. And the abolitionist movement during slavery was no different. Yes, it was abolitionists that funded that case with Dred Scott. They used this man who wasn't even strong enough to take his family into freedom when he lived years in a state where the law would have backed his freedom. They used him as a tool to set cases and precedents for their ultimate goal which was to abolish Southern state sovereignty and control because all the money in America was concentrated in the South. The abolitionist movement was not about white benevolence. It was not. I don't delve into these cases because I have a problem with Dred Scott. It's not to disrespect Dred Scott. It's not to disrespect our ancestors. I don't pull historical narratives and read through them and talk to you and let you listen to the words of our ancestors and of the people who dominated them so that I can drag Black ancestry. I do it because a lot of those mentalities exist today. There are many Black people today who literally somebody said, I'm not a slave. Are you saying nothing has improved? Of course, things have improved. I mean, we were literally in chains. Our ancestors were in chains. They were beaten, tied to trees. Their women were raped at will. Their babies' heads were bashed in. They were used for medical experimentation openly. Of course, things have improved. But honestly, if you're using the worst possible treatment a human being could ever suffer through as your barometer for how we're doing today, then your mindset is off. Just because I treat you the worst I possibly can and your treatment is so much better now doesn't mean that it's right. Doesn't mean that your current treatment is equal or right. And it does not mean that we can build on this trash foundation. I'm just trying to get you guys to see that foundationally this is trash. But you don't recognize that it's trash because so many of our minds are literally the same sort of mindsets that slaves had. We have the same mindset. We think the same. We literally think the same. We literally think the same thing our ancestors did. If only white people would accept us. If only I had the white house, the white car, the white clothes, the white brand names. If only I had those things. That is proof of my equality. This is how they kept the house slaves in check. Who was here for the slave narrative I read by Lewis Clark? Not Lewis Clark, the explorers, but Lewis Clark, the former slave, the escaped slave. Who listened to me read his narrative? He said the house slaves even get carriages. On the weekends, they can take the weekend off, get into a horse and carriage owned by their rich masters, and gallivant around the town like white people do. But the trade-off for the fancy car and the nice house and the clothes that are nicer than those field slaves was that your mindset had to grovel all the further down. You had to bring your mentality down to a place where you would never say anything to offend a white person. And how many Black people do we know today in their big houses with their cars and their jobs who think they have made it, who will never admit not one thing wrong about white culture and how it operates in the modern day? I dare say it is 99.9% of these Black people, these good Blacks, that Black wealth. And you might say, well, Irene, are you not a part of that class? I am, but I won't be bought off. There's not enough comfort for me to be bought off to be fake about reality. If I'm willing not to be fake about it, then why can we not all? This is not to disrespect our ancestors, though. This is not to disrespect our ancestors, though. Don't ever misunderstand me. This is not to make anybody look bad. It's because if we don't look ourselves in the mirror, our children will behave exactly like we do, exactly like our great grandparents did, exactly like our great 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 grandparents did. Exactly the same. They will be the same weakness that we see in every Black population on this planet. You name me one that is not weak. You name me one Black population that has stood firm, that has provided real adversarial brutality against those who would oppress them. You name me one population on this planet. I dare you. Name one. One. You give me one population of Black people on this entire earth who are not physically or fiscally dominated. Just one on the whole planet. How does this not enrage you? How do you not then say, oh my gosh, we need to really think about the way that we move? Maybe something is wrong with our mindset. Like, how? I don't understand. How is that not your logical conclusion? How can I be faulted for wanting to discuss it? You tell me. You cannot tell me because you are in the throes of a delusion. You are in the throes of an extreme delusion, a level of cognitive dissonance. We need to give it another name. There is no reason that we are dominated in every corner of the earth if there is not something very wrong with the way we operate as a people. And I don't say that because I don't love Black people. I say that because I love you. And being delusional is not going to help. We're always running back talking about Egypt. But look at the Egyptians now. They are basically white. So why do we even talk about Egypt? They were too weak to maintain their own power. They were too weak to maintain their own bloodline. They welcomed Alexander in with open arms because they could not defeat the Persians on their own. I just want to know of one. Give me one Black population on this planet who is not under financial or physical subjugation. Just one. And then we can talk about the validity or lack thereof of the commentary I do on this channel. Listen, this is not going to be, an ultra long video. I'm literally about to get off of here. I'm just saying, look, before you think my purposes are nefarious, before you think I'm taking history out of context, I guarantee you history is in more context on my channel than you might ever experience in life. I'm totally in context. I mean, I am in damn context. Your minds are out of context. So many of us, our minds are out of context that we cannot even conceive logic. I just marinate on it. For those for those who had for those who had a dissenting opinion, no, Razi, Egypt wasn't mixed from the beginning. But you're making my point. Egypt started out black, and look at it now. That's my point. This is the story of the history of our people on the planet. And the question is why? And my argument is that it is the mindset of our people. It is the way that we operate, the way that we think. And we have passed on a broken mindset generationally to the point that we are beyond conceptualizing different behavior. And in fact, we vilify people who push back against our collective thinking. But I ask you, where has our collective mindset got our people globally? Not just in America, but everywhere. You'll argue it got me a job, it got me a car, it got me a house. But with whose money? Even in Black countries where there are Black faces on the dollar, so many of them pay penance out to European countries. So many of them are still dominated by European powers. So many of them are literally in fiscal debt to the European. Somebody pointed out to me, shout out to him, that the name of the white woman in the Dred Scott case, the woman who owned him, that her name was Irene. And I said to him, well, you're just proving my point because you have a white name and I have a white name. You're proving my point. You're not making any point but my point. You have a white name and I have a white name. There are horrible white people with my name and horrible white people with your name because our parents both chose to give us white names. So what is your point? You're making my point. We have to try to have honest conversations with each other without offense. My goal, even though I'm not politically correct, the goal is not to be offensive. I don't make content. You know how some people make content and the goal of their content is to be offensive because people like to see controversial things? The goal of my content is not to be offensive to attract people who like to see controversial things. The goal of my content is to provoke you to think, to provoke us to have conversations, to provoke us to look at things in a different way, to provoke a thought process in myself and in you, and vice versa, when you guys respond to me, for us to provoke each other to be different, to think differently, to approach life differently, to speak to our children and our friends differently about these topics, because it is that collective mindset that we pass on to each other. So if we change our mindset, we will change our destiny. But if we insist on acting like all Black people did was be a victim, and there's no self accountability in anything that has occurred historically throughout the entire planet to Black people, it's no fault of our own. It's no weakness in us. It's no screwed up ideology. None of that. The consistency with which we're dominated has nothing to do with us. Well, I wonder where that's going to go. In fact, it literally depends on white people to completely change themselves because there's literally nothing Black people can do. It is the height of the worship of whiteness. It is the height of it. We get so caught up in stupid, petty arguments over little things But it's the big things we won't discuss. The things that actually affect change. And honestly, the algorithm really panders. The algorithm of these Jewish white owned media sources really panders to pushing asinine arguments, discussions that are fruitless and will go nowhere, but that sow division. I just want to be very clear on my channel. The goal is not to be inflammatory. The goal is not to divide. I want to see us collectively progress. That cannot be done if we all mentally, we don't have to come to an agreement on every topic, but if we mentally can't get on a page of analytical thought, void of delusion, then any conversation we have is for naught. It is for naught. And with that, I'm gonna leave it here. I feel like I don't want to drag totally into this. I'm gonna say this though. In the same way, we have the expectation that white people recognize the atrocities and the broken mindsets in their culture and correct them. We should, as Black people, have the same expectation of each other, that we look at mindsets and broken backward culture in the Black community and correct it. It's a two-edged sword. The thing is, we never want to point any part of it at ourselves. The biggest factor in the so-called oppression of Black people is us. I stand by that, and I don't think anybody can disprove it. And that is why we are consistently dominated globally. You know what they say? What is the factor that exists in all those situations? How is the same blueprint used over and over again? There's something about the way we operate. There is something about the way that we operate. There is something about the way that we operate that nobody wants to stare in the mirror, and it must change. And I stand by that. And if you don't want to hear that repeated in every possible way, my channel is the wrong channel for you. Because honestly, that's all I talk about. All day, every day, until you reach a place where you realize that the social political order is flawed and must be usurped. Until you get there with me, it's all I'm going to talk about. If you want to hear me shut up, then leave the channel or come with me on this journey. Let us do something. Let us make this make sense. Just because something makes us feel ashamed or uncomfortable does not mean that it is wrong. We need to bring shame back. We should start to feel ashamed. We should start to feel uncomfortable. It is our lack of shame and our complete comfort that is smothering our progress. And I stand by that. I can't be shaken off the square. But like I said, feel free for those who have a dissenting opinion to come down and tell me why I am wrong. Tell me where I've misinterpreted something, how I got it all backwards. And then we can talk and exchange opinions as long as we have the understanding that conformity of my mind is not going to happen because I've already thought the way that you think. Most of us think the way that most of us think, and we see our position. So one of us has to pivot so that more of us can pivot. I'll talk to you guys later, okay?